I want to introduce today my brilliant friend and former colleague, Teis Jorgensen. Teis, what is your official title these days at a company that, at which company? How are you
I am the
describing
Associate Director of Design Research and Behavioral Science at Frog, which is part of Capgemini Invent.
The reason for the confusion is because Frog, for those of you who don't know, about a 50-year-old design agency. Um, Many of the things that you've used in your life were designed by Frog, or at least the original was. You might have a knockoff version,
Yeah.
but the original Mac. If you've ever gone to a Disney park and they give you a little, RFID or other technology band that you sort of use throughout the park, that's a Frog design. Uh, Everything from chairs to sort of the way you wait
HBO.
for cancer treatment has been designed by Frog. They've been a dominant creative agency, and they were bought by a large French multinational, Capgemini, although remain somewhat an independent entity. I worked there. I came in there almost 2 years ago now to help bring behavioral science. Previously, I would describe Frog as doing what we would call epiphany-based design. So this is the idea that, and they did design research often, but what would happen is, you'd get some foundational or contextual research. Let's say Denisa came to us and said, "Hey, Matt, I want you to design a chair." We'd go do some contextual or foundational research around designing a chair, but then we'd really just get in a room and brainstorm chair ideas until one of them seemed good. And then that is the thing that you would sort of propose to the client. That's epiphany-based design. This is very different than behavioral science, right? Where the insights that you draw lead directly to the ideas that you propose, the interventions you propose, which then lead directly into tests that give you evidence that something is or isn't a great idea. So I came to Frog to bring that discipline about 2 years ago, left about 6 months ago. And while I was at Frog, Teis, tell us a little bit about how you got into Frog.
Yeah, I started as just within the design research track. So my job was conducting the qualitative and quantitative research that Frog uses to understand their users and develop new ideas and products. So I was very much on that side of the business, but my background was in behavioral science. I heard that they had hired Matt to lead this behavioral science discipline, and then went and chatted with Matt. Was like, "Hey, this is actually what my career has been to this point is behavioral science. I'm just pretending to be a design researcher quite effectively right now. If you'd like some assistance in helping build out the behavioral science discipline." And so then, yeah, I stepped in to help lead some of the trainings, support on some of the specifically behavioral science focused projects, and lead a couple of those. And then when Matt stepped away to start BeSci.io, the place I guess we're meeting in the digital sphere of right now, whatever that is, I stepped in to try to fill Matt's very large shoes.
Which you do very successfully. And I want to dig into something you just said, because you really, I mean, you've had a very interesting career. As you may have noticed, there's a slight age difference between Tice and I. He has hair, I do not. So when I started in behavioral science, it wasn't really a thing, right? There were no undergraduate degrees, there were no master's degrees, there were no PhDs, right? So I came out of a traditional social psychology program, worked in a social psychology lab for a few years, went off and did, my PhD in social psychology, left that to do my first startup at a time when I think my first title was like lead scientist or something, because behavioral science was not a thing that people sort of know. Tice, some number of years later, had a somewhat different path. So Tice, what'd you do study in college? Let's start with
Yeah, so I started my college journey actually in joint honors chemistry and physics, so like really hard sciences, and then got frustrated by only taking chemistry, physics, and math classes in order to fulfill the requirements of said major. So then transitioned from really hard sciences into environmental science, getting a little bit softer in it, and then from environmental science discovered economics and psychology. Loved that space. At that time, read one of Dan Ariely's books, which is a lot of people's kind of intro, I find these days, into the topic. He does a good job of breaking down psychological concepts in a way that is engaging to read about. And then decided to focus the rest of my undergraduate studies in economics, but specifically kind of the intersection of behavioral science, so psychology and economics, trying to understand how people make decisions and how they turn those decisions into action. I ended up taking a class as part of that, which was a seminar led by Professor Sendel Mulanathan, who at the time was teaching at Harvard College, has since moved on to Booth. And he was teaching a class called, it was something like behavioral science design or something like that. And so literally we were using principles from behavioral science to design better products and services out in the world. And so that was my first kind of foyer into it, kind of learned about the design practice around the same time, design as a discipline as well. Went and spoke to him, was like, hey, I'm really excited about this. How do I do this as a career? And he recommended I apply to the business that he had started called Ideas 42. That was originally a collaboration between him and two other professors that went from kind of like very academic think tanky into more nonprofit consulting work a little bit more. So that was kind of the start of my career. Spent just over 5 years at Ideas 42, kind of learning that craft before going into my master's program and then joining Frog.
And so, quick plug here for Ideas 42, which is many of the behavioral scientists that you like, respect, are interested in, follow their work, came through Ideas 42, right? It tends to be a breeding ground for a lot of people. It primarily focused on is governmental and nonprofit work, right? Often in the more service designy sort of space. It's relatively large. People do move on for a variety of reasons. The majority of them move on simply because Ideas 42 is set up as a nonprofit, and because of the clients it works with, its revenues are not incredibly high. And so many people move on, unfortunately, for sort of salary-based reasons. Although you had a stop between Ideas 42 and Frog in terms of education. Teis,
Yeah.
what made you, like, tell me about this, because you were doing it. You went BA, like went into Ideas 42, got to do a bunch of really practical work for a long period of time, and then made a little bit of a shift.
Yeah.
What sort of spurred that?
I mean, I'm a big believer that once you make a certain amount of money, more money doesn't actually add happiness to your life, right? So I feel like once you can feed your family, which Salary Ideas 42 plenty allows you to do so, you're pretty much set. For me, I was realizing the way Ideas 42 was set up, I'm not sure if they are still set up in this way. I was very much a generalist. I was doing everything that we kind of classify loosely as a behavioral scientist role, right? Which is everything from project management to actually like going out doing qualitative research, interviewing people, all the client management, the selling work. I was doing the quant work as well. I was the closest thing we had to a designer at the time. If you've seen my visual design work, you would not want to hire me for that.
I object because Teis's visual design work is actually lovely. He made a very nice little Matt Wallaert stick figure cartoon that I still use.
It's better than Matt's visual design skills, but that does not make me a visual designer. And so yeah, so I realized that like I was kind of working on projects from the initial sales call with a client all the way through implementation and testing and evaluation of that element. And I realized through that like massive journey where you wear a lot of different hats, I was most excited and interested about first understanding what the problem is and like that early kind of innovation, understanding how should we approach solving this problem, and interested in the kind of like first pass design work of like making that a reality, right? So understanding the problem and then actually proposing solutions to solve the problem, which design sits really nicely in that as a discipline, right? And so I wanted to level up my design skills and then also continue developing as a leader. And so I ended up choosing to go to graduate school for integrated design and management, which was offered by MIT. At the time. They've since kind of rebranded that program into something a little bit closer to a traditional design school, and they're figuring out that. But when I went, it was very much a collaboration between the School of Engineering and the School of Management, offering lots of like really interesting coursework at the intersection of engineering, design, and business. So yeah, so it was kind of a strategic move for me to move from kind of a purely behavioral science focused role where I was a generalist across all parts of the project into a more focused role where I was getting to work specifically within the world of design and specifically brand myself as a designer and get to focus on kind of that kind of middle stage or early stage, depending on your view on product development. So yeah.
Yeah, I want to double click on a couple of things you said in there. So last night we had because it's San Diego, Steph Habif actually came over to my house, which was fun. But she was talking a lot about starting her career from the point of business relevance, right? You know, saying, look, she's been at Tandem Diabetes for about 6 years, right? She said, look, I came and figured out what are the things that they have to do human factors research in order to get FDA approved. They have to do these things. I'm going to make sure that I cover these bases and then bring in behavioral science. So you talked a lot about starting to focus on that sort of interface between design and business. Was there an experience at Ideas 42 that sort of made you go, hey, this was a place that I needed to have more skill? Like as you're wearing more hats, was it more about like, hey, I just want to do more of this? What sort of made that change for you?
Yeah, I mean, I at my core am much more driven towards social impact than I am like business value, right? And so I imagine that like my the arc of my career, as far as I can predict it at my current stage, will go back towards social impact, right? That said, I think whenever you work in a certain discipline long enough or at a certain place long enough, you kind of get a sense of the limitations and where it really applies and where it could there are other disciplines to better understand that. I was interested in kind of actually developing more into products. You mentioned kind of Ideas 42 does a lot of services. I was kind of interested in like, what does it feel like to work in product design? So often you come up with an idea and you're like, this would actually be better as a product rather than as a service, right? And so I wanted to kind of develop that skills. And as soon as you're in the product realm, suddenly you have to really start understanding, right? You can't just be focused on the desirability circle of those three, right? You've got to talk about feasibility, you've got to talk about viability, and understanding and being able to translate across all three of those disciplines really is important. So I wouldn't say it was like the impetus for like going into my grad program, but that was definitely something I was looking at when looking at grad programs, was something that wouldn't just silo me as a designer creating beautiful things, but similarly wouldn't just get me focused on what is the business angle of this and kind of very surface level, kind of just thinking about how do you drive a profit off of it, right? So.
And Teis, you just mentioned three interlocking circles, which is a very, sort of MBA-like thing that some people may not be familiar with. Can you briefly describe viability, feasibility?
Yeah, it's a pretty common way to talk about product design and the three disciplines of design, engineering, and business. Making sure you first create a product that people want. That's the desirability quadrant, right? And that's where a lot of design fits in, creating kind of understanding user needs and then developing products that fit those user needs, and then making sure those products are sleek, sexy, beautiful, fun, whatever, kind of is most appropriate for that thing. That's all desirability. Viability is all whether it is a viable business opportunity, right? Are you going to make more money than you spend developing this thing? We could design the most beautiful art piece ever, but if it's not getting used, not enough people buy it, then it's not really viable. Your investment doesn't really pay off. Behavioral science is actually really important about understanding kind of that trade-off around how do you change lots of people's behavior at scale at a way that like is financially acceptable. That's all in the viability category. Feasibility is technical feasibility, right? How feasible is it that I can build this from an engineering standpoint? If we're designing that chair, making sure it is load bearing, that we can actually sit in it. If we're designing a website, it's making sure that like all our APIs are squared away and things are like communicating well in the background, so that we don't create websites that like look great on paper and then we try to bring it to a developer and they're like, sure, I can develop this, but it will cost us $2 million because none of these features are out of the box, right? So designing something well has to kind of fit in between those three different circles of desirability, feasibility, and viability.
One of the ways that you and I have talked about this in behavioral science is sort of the three phases of defining what is right, right? There's some business motion that says like, hey, I need everybody to get a flu shot, or I need everybody to buy chairs, or I need like, you know, pretty orthogonal to behavioral science. This isn't, behavioral science is adjacent to it, but it's not really, I don't go to Becky Judges and say, hey, Becky Judges, like, like tell me what business I should go into. That's not behavioral science, right? Something else about the business sort of states the business model. So what is right? Then there's sort of build the right thing, and then there's build the thing right. Behavioral science is right in that middle category. We don't really get involved. It is not behavioral science's job to say, hey, you should use this coding language rather than that coding language, right? That is all implied by sort of the phase that comes after us. And so we sit right in that middle phase with adjacencies for sure, but that is where the bulk of the work will get done.
I see this building bridges between those a lot of the time as well, right? Like I see behavioral science as a new language you can introduce to that diagram, right? That then helps people better understand what is the behavior we should be designing for, because that actually drives value in our business, right? That is in the viability thing, but you can approach it from a behavioral science lens, right? Then it's like, okay, we want people to do this behavior. What should we design? That's very much in the desirability, right? What is the thing that will actually change people's behavior in that way? And then you need to be able to communicate it to your coders at the other end, right? So you need to actually develop it in a way that then allows people to like feasibly build your design.
Yeah. Is there a favorite sort of project that you worked on while you're at Ideas 42? That you can talk about? I know some of them are.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great reminder that this is recorded on the internet. Yeah, I worked on a family planning project that I'm quite proud of in Senegal, where we got a chance to go out into community health posts in Senegal and interview women and providers to better understand what is driving women's choice of family planning products. What in the US is just known as the pill, right? But an IUD kind of solves that same thing. There are injectables, there are implants, there are all sorts of different elements there. So we were trying to increase the uptake of family planning products and understanding what was driving people's decision to use family planning. One of the interesting aspects of that is that, Matt and I have talked a lot about motivations, right? Like changing behavior is a lot easier when you know what the core motivation behind that behavior is, right? And you get into less kind of like gray ethical zone if there is like a clear motivation that you are helping somebody satisfy, right? And so actually defining that motivation was a key element of this project, which is, we are not in the business, particularly in family planning, of forcing people to use family planning if they do not want to use family planning. That is really bad in terms of an ethical standpoint. And so what we ended up focusing in on is women who want to space births, right? So women who have had a child. Culturally, for most Senegalese women, like it was important for them to have large families. However, it's also important for each child to be really healthy, right? And there's science that shows that like if you space births between 18 months to 2 years, that's kind of the minimum required in order for your next child to be really healthy. And so you could actually think about the use of family planning in kind of that moment where like breastfeeding no longer is happening as much. So about at 6 months onwards, then starting to like frame the conversation and choice around uptake of family planning products in those moments. So we designed kind of some new reminder cards and kind of referral cards during child immunization services. So women bring their young children to get immunized. This seems like the perfect moment to tell them all about family planning. There's a lot of reasons why it is not the perfect moment to tell them all about family planning, which we went through and discovered. And so but there is an opportunity here. They're in the health post. The same services are just on the other side of the health post. Why don't you go talk to the midwife over there who can help set you up and kind of have a conversation around your family and kind of the choices that you want to make for the health of your children. And so just kind of designing those referral cards and designing kind of the process by which women could be educated in a group setting at these health posts was really interesting. So
I love even the slight rebrand between sort of family planning and birth control, right? Birth control is a very different sort of word than family planning, right? When we're talking about spacing out births.
And family planning is the word that like all international health organizations use more than birth control, whereas birth control is like the kind of parlance of particularly in the U.S. So yeah.
So let's try and break that down a little bit, using sort of the stages that we acknowledge from behavioral science. So it sounds like the behavioral statement was around sort of, did you go in knowing, hey, we want to try and space these births out about to, like, how was the problem articulated when it came in?
Yep. Well, the problem originally articulated was that providers were not telling women about the family planning products, and we wanted providers to do a better job telling women. And very early on, we helped reframe and refocus on the behavior that they were actually interested in at the end, right? So we could spend all day changing what words come out of a provider's mouth, but at the end of the day, what actually mattered and what kind of was most important was uptake of family planning at the end, right? So instead, we focused on the behavior really from the view of the woman making the choice, in terms of women who come to a immunization day, who are interested in spacing births, want to or will take up family planning, and then to fill in the last bit of that behavioral statement, Matt, is the like data is like measured by percentage of women taking it up on the day or following a immunization day. So yeah, that's approximately. We were not writing behavioral statements at the time. The way we kind of articulated behaviors was people are currently doing X, we want them to do Y, which gets to some of all the various elements of, Matt, your kind of format for writing a behavioral statement, but doesn't get as precise or articulate quite the same level of data and limitations as the behavioral statement. That we've worked on together.
So we know. So we've got some idea of what we want women to do. What happened next, right? As you went through this process, presumably we're moving to some kind of insights phase. Are you on the ground in Senegal? Yep. Who goes? What are we studying?
We go on the ground. We look at kind of uptake patterns as well, kind of data that the Ministry of Health has on uptake, and then focus on certain regions that are lower uptake or kind of seeing a decrease in uptake, and then go into like 3 or 5 communities within a region, kind of one community every day, and spend the full day at the health post, right? So we go, we sit, we observe kind of the immunization day that happens. We then interview several women through translators that we have with us about their choices, how they think about their family, what's important to them in terms of health goals, etc. What kind of their views of family planning are in general, and we spend some time talking with the providers as well. And so with any work that this is pretty common from what I've heard from colleagues and from my experience in both Ethiopia and Senegal. You kind of have to start at the central Ministry of Health person, right? You're the kind of top person who's like head, and they introduce you to their chief officers, and then those chief officers introduce you to the regional health managers, and then those regional health managers introduce you to the head of the health post, and the head of the health posts finally kind of grants you access to the midwife working at that health post as well. So a lot of the early part of those trips was just like going through that pathway and understanding what is the view that some of the officials up at the top have of how things are happening on the ground, and then what is the actual daily realities of what's happening on the ground.
Yeah, I think this is I want to pause there before we go on to the rest of the process, because I do think this is important, and it came up a little bit last night as well. There's a tremendous amount of just sort of operational skill and operational resilience that goes into doing sort of field work and applied behavioral science, right? It's not easy to go through these things. It can take longer than you want. I think a lot of user researchers expect that they'll show up and they'll, someone will have already convened the people and you'll just interview the people and it will be very like, but that tends not to be true in behavioral science, right? Where it's not a market research company with an existing panel. You're actually going out and doing a lot of in situ observation, which of course is even more difficult when you're doing it in a country that's not yours and in a language that's not yours, et cetera. So were there key insights that sort of came from that research process that you took forward into design? Were there aha moments where you sort of like there's a strong inhibiting pressure, a strong promoting pressure that really, is, I think, going to make a difference here?
Yeah, so the inhibiting pressure that's kind of biggest in this area, right, of like what's really stopping people from taking up family planning on the day is, let's imagine that half of you unmuted your your mics right now and you had a screaming child in the background. Like that is the setting of a Senegalese health post, right? And so you are waiting for hours to get your child immunized, and then you're expected to make this like pretty personal decision in public about your own health in a context that's like hot and children screaming everywhere. So while it seems like the perfect moment, they're in the health post, quick, like help them understand family planning. It's not necessarily the right moment, right? So there actually needs to be a time delay factor there as well, where you provide information, kind of the initial seed, and then they have to go away or kind of come back another time to actually take it up. So integrating those two services was like a little bit more challenging than it initially seemed. The other one that is interesting is the context of a some semi-centralized health system, but where every health post kind of operates somewhat independently, right? Which means some of the information provided is totally accurate, up to date, like 100% correct, and presented in a way where the person communicating information is empathetic, warm, like knowledgeable, understands the needs of the people who are there and who have questions, right? And then sometimes it's just kind of a script, right? It's just like a very official sounding script around what family planning can do, should do, will do, right? And so that was kind of another issue, is that like the quality of information was very different across the two separate things. Are we like at time, Matt?
No, you're just halfway through, but because it's 8 o'clock, some people are dropping for whatever.
I see him. Okay.
Whatever.
So that's another insight that like the vehicle by which we were using to get information to women is somewhat unreliable at times, and somewhat they have lives, the health workers as well, that like get involved. So we were trying to figure out, are there different pathways or avenues that might be better at communicating all those promoting pressures, right? There's a lot fewer like opportunities to shift language around promoting pressures, all the reasons why you might want to consider family planning, when each person at the health post has their own version of that, and some people are better at communicating that than others. There was kind of a third one I was going to bring up, but it's slipping my mind now, and I don't know whether people are like gripped by this story. So, but yeah, so that was kind of two of the areas. So
I am gripped by this story, in part because I think it demonstrates the importance of field work. I don't think sitting in an office you would have said, hey, screaming children in a 3-hour waiting line are probably not the time to do it. But it's immediately obvious as soon as you get in situ that like this is a strong inhibiting pressure, that I'm like making a very personal decision in a very public way in an environment that's not conducive to decision making.
Yep. And if you Google integration, family planning, and immunization services, right, there are plenty of authors who have articulated why it's the perfect moment to get women to actually take up family planning services, and a lot less understanding or emphasis on the realities of that decision and the realities of that day, and whether or not that actually enables the decision.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is very tough to do applied behavioral science without sort of getting out there and actually watching it, watching whatever that baby behavior is happen, right? You can't do a cancer project and not sit in a cancer ward for a while.
Yep.
Right. I mean, it just doesn't, you don't get that same appreciation of those pressures that people might not articulate. I think in an interview, if I interviewed Teis about his family planning experience, he might not say, well, my kid was screaming at me, right? That he might not even consciously articulate that thing. That observational piece can be really, really key. So you've got some hey, there's some inconsistency in the and how people are communicating. Promoting pressure is really specific language works, but it's hard to get people to deliver that language. Plus I have all these inhibiting pressures. It's a public moment, it's loud, it's chaotic, I've been there for hours, like I want to do the thing that I came here to, there's sort of a jobs to be done sort of lens. I came here to get immunization. I didn't come here to do anything else, and so I'm not in that frame of reference. You
On
take that.
that point, Matt, as well, like we have two different users, right? We have the women whose behavior we're trying to change, but we also have the health workers, right? And talking about jobs to be done, like the health worker very much sees that as an identity, that I am an immunization worker. I get measured on how many immunizations I get through today, right? And so if that's what I'm aiming for, and not kind of the broader image of the whole health of the woman, right? Then suddenly my focus is get as many needles and as many babies as quickly as possible to get the immunizations over with and kind of move on with my day, right? Which is a very different context than like the kind of informed communication of information that's like kind of sensitive around family planning as well. So we were actually working against some identity elements as well for the providers, and some providers, that wasn't part of their job. And so we had to suddenly like reframe kind of what their goal was in terms of, sure, you're doing immunizations. That's because you care about the health of this child and the health of this family. If you think about the health of this child, like getting the mother to think about family planning and spacing births is actually really important for the nutritional health of this child as well, right? And so there was some work to like reframe kind of their identity as well in terms of the very specific narrow focus they had going into an immunization day.
So putting that differently, even if the behavioral statement that was expressed was around the mother, I want the mother to do this thing, you recognize operationally, hey, I have to do another behavioral statement in order to accomplish that, right?
Yeah.
Operationally. It's not, I have no desire to fix health workers just because I want to fix health workers, but it is the route by which I sort of accomplish my macro behavioral statement.
Which one's the outcome and which one's the pathway, right? That's kind of the key. The outcome you care about is women taking up family planning. The pathway might be specifically directly changing context of her experience, but changing the context of her experience also means focusing on the health worker because they own so much of her experience, right?
Got it. So you can imagine this sort of nesting of behavioral statements, and you could imagine continuing down that line, right? In order to change the behavior of the health workers, we need to change the behavior of the health post head, and what things need to happen. Like kind of going back up that chain you started at, all the way back up to the head of ministry, about like what things need to happen here to cause these ripple effects down there. So now you've got some insight. You've got a good, strong behavioral statement. You've got some insights. How does the design? Are you doing the design? Is it participatory design in Senecal? How is the design step happening here, where we're starting to get to sort of potential interventions?
Yeah, we developed initial design ideas from everything from like redesigning the health card to changing, like making it more formalized, a referral process between immunization workers and midwives and family planning staff, and kind of like looking at a lot of different angles for this thing. And then we brought initial designs back into the health posts to get feedback on, see how they might work, like ask people to actually try using them during immunization day, and just saw how like totally off we were the first time, right? Like we made a lot of decisions that like, 10 minutes into a test, you can be like, oh yeah, this does not work at all, right? And this is not the direction we should be going in. So that trip in particular, we spent a lot of time like refining and reiterating some of those design concepts. In the end, what we ended up with was a combined referral card. So a card that like acts as a checklist for a provider to be able to quickly check off like, did you talk about immunization? Did you talk about family planning? Did you talk about nutrition? Those are kind of the three things that were important about the child's health. And when is the next appointment? And then also kind of changing the type of messaging from 0 to 3 months, 3 to 6 months, and beyond 6 months, because there are different immunization visits where the age of the child, but the kind of messaging you need to be providing the woman about family planning changes drastically between those 3 different touch points. One of them is, hey, have you considered it? What a beautiful baby. You may want to consider once you stop breastfeeding to think about this. The next one is, hey, your 6 month point, that's when the natural method is what it's called, when breastfeeding no longer will necessarily stop your body from ovulating. So at 6 months, it's kind of important for you to start really considering it. After 6 months, like at any moment, you actually technically could get pregnant, particularly if you are not consistently breastfeeding at that moment. And so the messaging at those 3 different time periods are really important. The biggest thing that we actually did, though, is that we changed the whole messaging away from a health provider providing information about this to an audio drama. And so what we did is we created these like little 2-minute, 1-minute little audio dramas, hired a Senegalese actress, a few Senegalese actors, and then had them have conversations. So Aminata was talking to her friends about the health of her child. And when you went to the health post, you got to sign up with your phone number. They called your phone, and then it's a pre-recorded thing, but it's this like kind of soap opera between Aminata and her friends discussing all the things about family planning, nutrition, etc., but in the context and in the language that they would be using to describe it as well, right? So we really work to like fine tune that language to make it as like approachable, accessible as possible for people, and like directly addressing some of the inhibiting pressures, some of the concerns that they were addressing. You know, will this family planning method make me sterile? No, it definitely won't make you sterile when used correctly and use space, you know, you stop using it a certain amount of time before you want to get pregnant and stuff like that, right? So all of this like kind of messaging that we heard, the mixture of all the reasons why some people use it and some people weren't aware of those promoting pressures, and some of the inhibiting pressures, you know, why might you be scared to use family planning methods, being able to address all those in like very normalized common language. And so then you would get a call every 2 weeks or so with kind of the next episode of said thing. And so it ended up being kind of this dual approach, some of which was like making things a little bit easier and better at the health post, and some of it being like getting information directly to women's ears that then would be like relevant to where they were at the age of their child and stage of their decision-making process.
Got it. And it sounds like I heard some testing in there. We designed something, we went in there and went, no, that wasn't it.
Yep.
Were you able to sort of do long-term?
We did an RCT actually. So my involvement on the project kind of diminished shortly after the design was developed. And so some other people at Ideas for Two stepped in to run that. I kind of got pulled into other work. However, we were running a randomized control trial where we actually implemented that across lots of different health posts and then measured, you know, was there an increase of usage of family planning as well? I have the numbers somewhere, but we actually saw a statistically significant positive result where these health like reminder cards and referral cards were implemented and these like audio dramas were delivered, women were more likely to take up family planning.
And not just statistically significant, but hopefully operationally significant. You know, something that made scaling this make sense for the ministry.
Yep. This is again where my involvement kind of started to peter out. And so I have less visibility on that. I think like that is always the challenge, right? Going from the initial pilot into the like larger scale implementation and making that case really strong. Particularly working with government, like priorities change. There are a lot of options that like, so I've worked on a fair share of projects without naming others that like, you develop a good idea, you get positive results, and then for whatever other reasons, like it doesn't make it any further.
So you actually are anticipating my next question. We talked through an example of something that went really, really well in your experience as a behavioral scientist, without naming any specifics. When things don't go well, where do you see breakage in the behavioral science process? You know, when things are not going the way that you want them to go, where have you experienced challenges? And what did you do to get through those challenges that other people can learn from?
I mean, the most common challenge I see is that the desire for experimental evidence is just relatively low across the market. No matter what partner I've seen, like once I come in with a brilliant idea and I, apply my charismatic self to convincing you that this is an exciting idea, people are bought into it, right? They hear the stories of this health post, they're like wowed by this exciting thing, and they're like, yeah, sure, let's go, let's run with it, right? Without actually investing in understanding, is this really changing behavior in the right way, right? So I see a lot of like partners not investing in the like later phases of the behavioral science methodology, right? Of that pilot testing and actually evaluating whether something is going well. So I think like landing that is like a consistent challenge I have found, is like getting people to be excited about and interested in really that like backbone of evidence that truly shows you are able to change behavior, rather than like the concept that then they will kind of move forward with operationally. There are a lot of other like stumbling blocks I've seen. I think like qualitative research is one of those things that like is easy to do poorly and difficult to do extremely well, right? And it's a little bit hard to put your finger on, particularly when you're early on, like what does good qualitative research consist of and feel like, right? Like so often in a interview or observation setting, you have your guide, but you actually need to be thinking about what are the larger, broader research questions I'm interested in focusing on here. And getting too focused on exactly the questions that you've written in your guide actually makes you lose the thread of what the person is telling you right now, right? And actually digging into specifically what their core motivations or needs are as well. So I think the ability to leave behind a guide and interact with this person directly and get some like real depth of understanding. I would say like 80 to 90% of the qualitative research out there, I see people taking on face value what people say they want. And that is like really detrimental to actually understanding what would really change behavior, right? You need the observation, you need to actually dig deeper into why do they say that, what is it about it? Because that actually, that why gets you like way deeper understanding around what possibly you should be developing. I don't know if that answers your question, Matt.
No, I think it does, and I want to sort of, because of your particular specialization, I want to take us through the last 15 minutes. And again, if people have questions, they're welcome to use the comment box. I want to take us through the last 15 minutes, really digging deep on one of your specialities, which is qualitative research, where you have more experience than I do, and a degree and are very talented at. One of the things I know about you, for example, is that you also have experience in improv comedy, right? That improvisation has been a big part of how you've built that skill of being able to go off script. Was that deliberate? Was that sort of, I mean, did you recognize that was making you better, or it's just sort of happened? Or tell me a little bit about sort of where that improvisational piece came in.
Looking back, I 100% recognize that it is like probably the skill set I bring to my work that like matters most of all. Like I think improv has served me incredibly well. I did not in high school join my first improv team because I thought one day it would like be really impactful in designing running behavioral science projects. Right. That is definitely not how I got into it. I got into it because I thought it was fun and it was a form of comedy, and I was like interested in performance. Right. The honing of improv in terms of like, you know, the basic tenet, if you know anything about improv, you know the phrase yes and, right? You know the phrase of like, yes, I accept whatever you have told me. If you tell me this is a cake, I was like, oh yes, that is a beautiful cake. I love the red icing on top, right? And suddenly, as a very basic example, I have accepted that not only is this a cake, I didn't say, well, that's not a cake, that's a gun, right? Like that's the basics of improv, is that you accept what is true and then you build upon it. Quite literally, that is what a lot of like research is doing, except you are not inserting yourself into the conversation as much, right? You are just being able to say, like, this is what I heard, or could you expand upon that, right? And so you are setting them up to kind of react specifically to what they said, and then be able to parrot that back and understand, like, is that what they were trying to communicate? And so that is a skill of being in the moment has been like really valuable. As a researcher, I think like you know, improv can be dangerous because improv is performative and research is like more observational, right? But for sure, in terms of like leading meetings and presenting work and stuff like that, improv comedy has been the biggest blessing. I was talking to somebody else who did improv in college, and they were like, yeah, more than anything else, I use improv than any other skills I've gotten. So that's definitely rings true for me personally as well.
Yeah, I love the point you're making about acceptance, right? Particularly when you're dealing with a topic that you may have your own individual feelings about, like family planning, right? Like I have to accept what you're saying as valid. You know, we talk in DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy, about, you know, just sort of, I don't have to agree with you. I can accept that the cake is the cake. I can privately think, no, it's a gun, but like I can validate, right? We talk about the skill that is validation. I can validate, yeah, that's for you, you are genuinely seeing it as a cake. I acknowledge that you see it as a cake, even if I disagree, even if I have my own feelings, even if, you know, I can sort of step away from that, which I think is an important skill in qualitative. One of the questions that has come up from Caitlin and Becky is, you know, how do you do this when your audience, you know, when the context is business, right? When the context is something that, you know, it isn't as easy necessarily to always go and do observational work. And Teis, if you have answers, I have thoughts, but
yeah, I mean, in general, Caitlin, like you hopefully have some sort of access to a user in some way, right? Even within a software as a service business. Very basically, you can observe how people are clicking through your product, right? So I've spent actually part of my work before is like redesigning a website, and you can like look at cursors running through the screens and be like, wow, that's a weird path for whatever they were trying to do, right? And so there are research tools that you can do to do more observational things, even when looking at a software platform. The other thing is like just reach out and ask people, right? Much better than a 5-question, how was that call kind of survey, right? Is a 15-minute conversation or half-hour conversation where you pay them for their time, you compensate them, and then you get to ask them questions around like, why were they using the software? What were they hoping to do? And stuff like that, right? One of the elements, moving away from academic qualitative research into more design research, which is my discipline, focus on the outcome you're interested in, right? I care less about the question that you ask and getting like precisely the same answer, or like comparing answers to the same question. That's quant research, but like in a qual setting. It's quant research without the like sample size, right? Which is the worst of both worlds. So instead, like focus on the thing you are trying to understand. Bring in, kind of resources into that call. If that is screens that you want to talk through. One of my favorite tools as a design researcher is just like bringing in tiles with words on them. And so things like, do you care about this product being efficient? Or do you care about it like knowing who you are and being a personal advisor? Both of those are things that might be true of your SaaS product, right? It just is about efficiency. Let me get in, get out, be done, versus like, I want you to anticipate my needs and be able to offer new things, right? Getting a sense of which of these is actually speaking to your users gives you a huge like leg up in actually understanding what are the product decisions I should be making. So observational is possible. You just have to be a little bit more creative for it, and you have to actually set aside time and money to doing the good research for it, right? It is going to be hard, sitting behind your desk trying to figure that out. But as soon as you actually gain access, I think you can learn a lot.
The thing that I'll add, which I agree with all of that, I used to challenge my researchers to have research conversations in which you never talked about the product, right? Because the product is some mechanism for accomplishing something for that person, right? It's a tool. All SaaS products are a tool to help me do something that I care about. So can you talk to me about what I care about, not about the tool? So as an example, my first startup that I joined was in the personal finance space. And I never talked about our website, and I never looked at click-through traffic. I would just say, hey, Teis, I'm going to be in your neighborhood. Let me take you out to lunch. You've been a great user. I'd love to take you out to lunch. And then I just ask him questions about finance in general. And one of the key things to do is, rather than ask him how he feels or thinks, we have very poor access as humans to our own thoughts and feelings. It's very biased, the way that we look at things in retrospect. Teis talked in retrospect. Yeah, absolutely. My improv was good for me, right? And so he can weave that into his story, but that wasn't genuinely what he was feeling in the moment. So one of the things that I'll do is ask about people, rather than saying, how did you feel about a thing, put forth the feeling and then ask them to generate the situation. So Caitlin, can you tell me about a time that you were really frustrated by money, right? Or can you tell me about a time when you and your partner celebrated something about money? When did you and your partner fight about something about money, right? Like you can just start to ask these questions that lead people to describe a situation to you, right? Rather than metacognate about their thoughts or emotions. That's really useful in SaaS software, because most people, a well-designed SaaS software thing, I don't actually have emotional, like I don't have emotional or thoughtful interactions with it. It's a tool, right? And so even if you take something like a consumer service like Uber, right? It's hard to say, how do you feel about Uber, and get any kind of reasonable answer. But if you could say, Caitlin, think about the worst Uber ride you ever had. Tell me about that. Think about the best Uber ride you ever had. Tell me about that, right? I can readily do both of those things. I've had no consideration of this question, but I can easily be like, well, I was on the way back from the Seattle airport and there was a wreck that happened right in front of us, and the Uber driver pulled over, and he and I like pulled people out of the wreck, and like he was very thoughtful and kind about how long it, he didn't get worried about how much money this was going to cost or anything. He was just in the moment with me, like doing the thing. That's probably my best Uber ride, right? My worst Uber ride was, some guy who like parked in the mud and then got mad that I got mud in his car. And I'm like, well, dude, like, don't park in the, like, there's a driveway here. You could have just parked in the driveway and then I wouldn't be muddy. I don't want to be muddy either. Right. See, I can immediately tell you these situations, but if you said to me, how do you feel about Uber? I'd be like, I don't know. Teis, how do you feel about Uber?
Yeah, you get to business practices and all the other, the news stories about Uber rather than the experience of using Uber, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I feel fine about Uber. I don't know.
Right? Whatever is top of mind for me in that moment, right? That's what you get. So it's about prompting whatever is, that top of mind experience that you want to tap into.
And this goes back to in some ways, ties to your sort of improvisational experience, right? Like you're taking the thing that the person is handing you and trying to pull on that thread rather than sort of redirecting them to whatever your script was and things. Now, in academia, we need to ask the same questions the same way because we care about this sort of the ability to cross compare between people in a rigorous way. I think part of what I heard you say was, I'm trying to get the right answer. Like the point of what I'm doing is trying to get the right answer.
In fact, I'm actually not trying to get the right answer. I'm trying to build the right product, right? Like I care less about specifically, the feeling associated with Uber. I care more about what change should we make to Uber to make more people drive vehicles or take Ubers, right? Like that's what I care about. And so the emotional or the feeling behind it is like a means to an end, right? I care about the end behavior more than I care about the specific experience in that moment per se.
And this is another way of restating what you said earlier, right? When you get too focused on the guide, I think about I really try to understand why Caitlin feels away. No, I'm not. I'm trying to change what Caitlin does at the end of the day. I'm constantly zooming back up. The point of a behavioral statement, hopefully, is to help us sort of remember why the heck we're doing this in the first place.
And then the trap is, right, as soon as you abandon the guide, you still need to understand where your North Star is, right? Like if I only have an hour with you, and if we spend half an hour of that talking about the style of coffee that you really enjoy, and I can't figure out how to bring that into how I want to redesign Uber, then suddenly we've also missed an opportunity here, right? So the skill of a really good qualitative researcher is understanding when is it relevant and really helpful, and when is it about moving on or positioning or grabbing onto something there, which is oh, you just spent, Caitlin, you spent half an hour just now talking about this brand of coffee that you really like. If I can actually understand why you really like this brand of coffee and then use that as an understanding of what drives your passion towards that, and I could then take insights from that, then suddenly we're in a different ballgame, right? I could then start applying that in. But actually understanding what is that North Star, what is the thing you're trying to learn, allows you to kind of navigate whatever path they get you towards that end goal without suddenly being oh, great, you had coffee this morning. Let me ask you about, my next icebreaker question, which is where in the country do you live, right? So there's ways of navigating that more smoothly as well, which is a good qualitative researcher makes it feel to the other person like you are having a back and forth conversation, and I am agreeing with what you're saying, and we're just interacting normally. But the result of that is actually I've gotten you to talk way more than I've spoken, right? I've gotten language in your words. I've made a fool of myself by saying you just said you hate Uber, but I'd actually really like to understand what do you hate about Uber? Sometimes it's even more painfully obvious than that, right? If Matt says the Uber showed up late and that was irritating, my first question isn't just oh great, it's irritating when Uber show up late. My first question is, Matt, why was that irritating? And that's an obvious question to any if we were having a conversation right now, Matt and I would just be yeah, that's irritating, bro. I feel you. Last time it came late for me, that frustrated me as well. But as a researcher, my goal is actually be wait, could I get Matt to articulate exactly why it's frustrating every time an Uber comes late? how does that impact Matt's day? What does that mean? And so we can actually like bring some emotional content and quality to that understanding, that insight as well.
Yeah, I love the point that you made, Tice, about it should feel to the other person like a conversation. So one of the reasons I like getting out of the office and having lunch, it feels to the person like, oh yeah, this person's just having a conversation with me. He's a real human. I go away, one of the things I always talk about is, do you go away liking the researcher, right? If you feel like you just had a conversation with someone you actually like, that's a good sign, right? Whereas if if someone is essentially delivering a survey auditorially, right, like quant through qual methodologies, you don't get any attachment to that person. I have, no attachment to the sort of survey person who calls me up and asks me a series of scripted questions, right? I should like Matt and want to talk to him again, right? There's a sort of NPS version of this, which is like, would I want to have another conversation with Matt? And you want that to be high, right? You want it to feel like someone was genuinely heard.
And I guess the perspective is like, it needs to feel like a conversation for them, and it cannot feel like a conversation for you, right? Like every time you just want to jump in and like affirm or be like, yeah, totally, and tell about your own thing. Like that's what we do in conversation. In research, that's not what you're doing, right? You are like digging deeper, understanding more, like being openly curious, right? And it can feel like a conversation, even if you ask why 7 times in a row. I've done that. And it still feels like a conversation, but I'm actually getting deeper and deeper rather than hitting just that surface level insight.
I love that. And that's a great note to end on. I know we're at time. Thank you to Tice for joining me. Thanks to everyone for coming. We'll get this published out so that everybody can get their questions answered. Kaylin, great question. Hope everyone has a wonderful weekend. And I'll see you all on down the road. Thanks, Tice.
Thank you, Matt. Thanks, everybody.